Hi, and welcome to today's episode of the Property Pod. My name's Libby, and today I'm joined by Will from our litigation team. Welcome to the podcast. Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much.
And we're going to talk about collective enfranchisement. So, Will, what exactly is a collective enfranchisement?
Well, put simply, collective enfranchisement is a right of leaseholders to purchase the freehold of their block. So if you think about a typical block of residential flats divided into individual leasehold units, the freehold will belong to a third party typically. So that may be a company or an individual, and that person is in control of the service charge and the ground rent. And to end that relationship, the leaseholders can join together and with each other collectively purchase the freehold from the freeholder. And that's, in essence, is collective enfranchisement.
Okay, great. And why would leaseholders want to collectively enfranchise?
Well, unfortunately, many freeholders over the years have developed a bad reputation, and sometimes the relationship between leaseholders and freeholders can become quite exploitative. The thing about collective enfranchisement is that it puts control in the hands of the leaseholders, so they can self-manage, self-govern, and they can control the service charge budget, for example, for their block. The primary drivers really are if, for example, there's been a lack of maintenance over the years and the leaseholders want to make sure that the property is maintained properly, or if they feel like the service charges are excessive, so they're too high and there's too much being paid to the freeholder for too little in return, then they may want to take control for that reason. But also the third main driver is that if your lease is quite short in terms of years, once you own the freehold, you can grant yourself a lease extension. So that's another primary motivation. But it's generally considered a healthier way of owning leasehold property because there isn't this difference between the freeholder on the one hand and the leaseholders on the other. Enables people who live in the same building or own property in the same building to be more in control of their situation in a general sense. So those are the main drivers for a collective enfranchisement application.
And do all blocks of flats qualify for collective enfranchisement?
No, they don't. It won't apply in all situations. In the majority of typical, block of flats, you would expect the block to qualify. But there are some qualifying criteria which you need to assess before you embark upon an application like this. For example, a block must consist of at least 2 flats. You need to look at the makeup of the block as well, because if more than 25% of the total floor space is non-residential, then that block won't qualify either. So you think about it in terms of where there are large commercial areas, shops on the ground floor, something like that, with flats above. A situation like that would need to be looked at more carefully to make sure that the qualifying criteria was met. The other thing to look at is the nature of the leases as well. So if you have a block of flats, you can't assume that all of the flats are held on long leases. So you need to make sure that at least 2/3 of those flats that are in the block are held on long leases, by which we mean sort of typical residential 100-year, that sort of thing leases. So there are some qualifying criteria. But in the whole, this is a process that's available to most leaseholders in my experience.
Mm-hmm. And how do you get organised for collective enfranchisement?
Well, in practice, you need someone with good organisational skills, someone within the block, whether they own the flat or live in the block, who's capable of bringing everybody together. Because in the first instance, it's an information exchange. Somebody needs to gather the information, embark upon the initiative, and communicate that to all of the other leaseholders to explain the merits of making the application. So ordinarily, there might be a sort of group Zoom call, or there may be a physical meeting if the facilities are there to accommodate that. But essentially, it's about 1 or 2 people, in my experience, within the block who sort of take the reins, take it forward, and lead the application. Because in the first instance, what you want to do is sort of explain how this can be achieved, what the benefits of achieving it are, and then try to establish how many people within your block might be interested in participating.
Mm-hmm. And how do you assess the purchase price?
When we talk about collective enfranchisement, this is actually the purchase of the freehold. So the freeholder will be paid a sum of money, which we call the premium, and it's a complicated formula to establish how much money is actually paid. And so in all of these cases, we recommend the services of an expert surveyor. are employed. So it's worth just sort of searching. Maybe go via RICS, which is the registered body for surveyors, to try to find an expert in leasehold enfranchisement. And that individual will then look at the leases, look at the block, may come and do a physical inspection, will look at the title documents, and elements such as, what ground rent is payable, how long are the leases, what land might be included within the freehold, all feed into the formula. And so an expert surveyor would be able to assess the value. It's probably reasonably important to do that at an early stage so that people understand what financial commitment is going to be involved in being part of the participating group.
Mm-hmm. And what does the solicitor do?
Well, the solicitor gets on board typically once that initial meeting has taken place. So what you're looking for is at least 50% of leaseholders forming your participating group. So you've got 10 flats, to use a simple example. Provided that 5 owners participate in the group, they have the basis upon which they can take it forward. At that point, a solicitor should be employed. And what the solicitor will usually do is recommend a participation agreement, which is effectively a contract between those leaseholders who are involved in the group. And it sets out their rights and obligations, what the timescales are, when payments will be required, what the consequences of withdrawing from the group might be, so that this collection of individuals who might not know each other very well actually do have, a binding commitment to each other to go forward with this project. So the solicitor's first involvement will be to draft a participation agreement. He or she will also check the qualifying criteria to make sure, as we discussed, that your block does actually qualify for the application. And then ultimately, once those two things have been checked, the solicitor will advise on the nominee purchaser. So this is the idea that an entity will have to be formed, and this is usually a company made up of the leaseholders, because otherwise you'd have one or two nominees, which probably doesn't work very well. The ideal way to proceed is to form a company which will own the freehold. The leaseholders are then members of that company, and the company becomes their nominee, i.e. it's nominated to effect the purchase on their behalf. So the solicitor will get involved in the formation of that company. So once you have your participation agreement, your valuation advice, and your company, you're ready to go forward. The solicitor will find out who your freeholder is. I mean, you may think you know, but it's worth checking that, and where they can be served with documents. And once all of that has taken place, the solicitor drafts what's called the initial notice. And this is the formal commencement of the process, whereby a notice is served on the freeholder stating the intention of the leaseholders to purchase the freehold. And so that's the initial involvement of the solicitor at that stage.
Mm-hmm. And can you tell me a little bit more about the process?
Well, so we've got to the point in the previous description where the initial notice has been served. This is the notice that once it lands on the doorstep of the freeholder, they know that the process has begun. The notice will specify a time period which must be not less than 2 months for the freeholder to serve their counter notice. Now, the essential qualities of the tenant's notice, the leaseholder's notice, is that it will suggest a price. So that would be the opening price that they want to purchase the freehold for. What happens then is that the freeholder sends the nominee company an information request. So they're saying, well, prove to us that you're actually entitled to purchase the freehold. And that's where the work of the solicitor becomes important, because your solicitor will have checked your entitlement before the notice is served. And so a response is made to that notice. The freeholder then commissions their own valuation advice, and then they serve a counter notice. And their counter notice effectively responds to your initial notice, and it says either, yes, we think you are entitled to purchase the freehold, or, and there are rare examples where this is the case, they say, no, we don't think you are entitled. For example, where the floor space is more than 25% non-residential, they might say you don't meet the qualifying criteria. But all of that should have been checked out. So that, as a group of leaseholders, you would be expecting a positive counter notice. The counter notice will suggest the freeholder's price, which inevitably will be higher than the leaseholder's price. There then begins a process of negotiation, which will last for at least 2 months and may last up to 6 months, during which valuers engage with each other, exchange their calculations and their evidence, and try to reach an agreement on what the price should be. In rare examples, an agreement isn't reached, and at that point the leaseholders group collectively make an application to the tribunal to determine the price that's payable. That application must be made within 6 months of the date of the counter notice served by the landlord. Applications to the tribunal are quite rare. It's normal, I would say in sort of 90% of cases, that an agreement is reached. Once the price is determined, there then begins a sort of conveyancing exercise whereby the freehold is transferred to the nominee company. And on the day of completion, the nominee company steps into the shoes of the freeholder. They then become responsible for all of the freeholder's obligations, which normally include repairing the block, insuring the block, and administering the regulations that relate to living in the block. So there's quite a lot of responsibility that transfers at that point, but of course that is the object of the exercise. And once that's completed, the final thing that a solicitor might do is have a look at the terms of the leases. So to the tenant leaseholders, now that they own the block and they're masters of their own destiny, they can make changes to their leases if they want to. One of the obvious changes, which I mentioned at the outset, is they may want to extend their leases to make them longer in term, which is one of the big values, really, of the exercise. So that, in summary, is the process.
That's great. Well, thanks so much for coming on today's episode. It's great to have you on.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And for all you guys at home, if you did enjoy this episode, please don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.